So much, firstly to CSEC, and especially, of course, to Kristen, Kanishka, and Priyansh for organizing this workshop and the related reading group. Unlike Kanishka, I will be boring and I will read some parts of the paper and present the key arguments. The slides are there just for the people to kind of follow my argument as a guide. And so, as Priyansh has mentioned, I've written a paper on Hamza Alvi for this workshop and for the special issue coming out of it. And the paper is titled Alvi Contra Alvi, Towards a Conjunctural Awareness. Now, for those who are not familiar with Hamza Alvi, Alvi was a prominent Pakistani sociologist involved with the formation of the State Bank of Pakistan, and then later was an integral or a major figure in the UK, in the New Left milieu in the UK. He contributed seminally to a number of areas in Marxist and anti-colonial, post-colonial theory thinking, as we will see. But what has happened is that, and partially, and I talk about this in my paper, that's partially due to the form of Alvi's writing, his conceptual output, theoretical output has mostly been subjected to a number of partial uptakes in Pakistan and beyond. There has been what I would say a kind of provincialism to his reception, as opposed to embedding him in the wider constellation of Marxist engagement during his time. And as a result, most engagement and critiques of Alvi have been limited purely to what I would call to a purely empirical level. This essay, however, aims to evaluate Hamza Alvi's hour as a whole, not to conjure up a false unity where none might exist, but to understand the continuities and discontinuities, strengths and pitfalls of the different aspects of his work. And most importantly, to shed light on the implicit and explicit problematic, that is, the assumptions and the presuppositions, both conceptual and historical, which underpin Alvi's arguments. As such, my aim is to both force the Alawian reception out of the curious Pakistani or at best South Asian provincialism, which has been its fate, and to consider its productivity and limitations, both in his own day and especially today. Now, just a brief recap of his main arguments about the post-colonial state and peripheral capitalism. Alvi's theorization of what he calls the overdeveloped post-colonial state, proposed in 1972, has been much commented upon. Indeed, according to a Pakistani commentator, it has been omnipotent and omnipresent in Pakistan. But rarely has there been an attempt to embed this in the wider Marxist and anti-colonial milieu from which Alvi emerged. Exceptions which may be mentioned here are the work of Tariq Azim Khan, Sayyid Azim, and Asim Sajjad Akhtar. However, here too there has been a limited elaboration of the tenets of what I would call Alvi's fundamental problematic. Now, to recap the main coordinates of this theory, of his theorization of the post-colonial state, for Alvi, colonial formations are characterized by a plurality of dominant classes. Three dominant classes to be exact: the indigenous bourgeoisie, the metropolitan bourgeoisie, and the landed class, which are not in antagonistic contradiction within the structure of peripheral capitalism. Relatedly, the post-colonial and the colonial state takes on a mediatory role and a relative autonomy of a different order, according to Alvi, compared to the Western capitalist state. Here, the overdeveloped state mediates between the three dominant classes, and specifically the military bureaucratic oligarchy, according to Alvi, develops independent material basis of accumulation. Alvi also focuses here on the importance of what he calls the auxiliary salariat class, the educated, professionalized, white-collar stratum with its main basis in the state apparatus. Now, Alvi's conception of the overdeveloped post-colonial state is integrally related to his theorization of peripheral capitalism, which is based on the following tenets. For Alvi, colonial social formations, like India, are characterized by one, a generalization of wage labor and surplus appropriation through economic coercion alone, the separation of the economic and political moments of domination, disarticulation of extended reproduction of capital because of the links to the metropolis, that is the mother country, and as a result, labor-intensive forms of underdevelopment and formal subsumption only. This, for Alvi, gives rise to a plurality of dominant classes and therefore the mediatory role of what he calls the overdeveloped post-colonial state. Now, Alvi's theses were engaged with in Pakistan and beyond. In Pakistan, as I've already talked about briefly, this was mostly at an empirical level of evaluation, which led to no sustained consideration of Alvi's fundamental problematic. However, placing Hamza Alvi in his own historical context gives a clearer idea. For example, and I would just flag some of these critiques, not go into much detail of them. If from African context, Alvi was responded to by people like Colin Lees, John Saul, Issa Shivji. In Latin America, a group around Emanuel Wallerstein and the Capital State group, for example, people like Sherry Gerling, Wolfgang Hein, Konrad Stanzel. In Sri Lanka, in South Asia, Hira Singh and SBD De Silva, whom we heard from about from Kanishka, also responded to Alvi, and Iqbal Ahmed, the kind of famous revolutionary and guerrilla fighter. Now, I won't go into the specifics of their critiques, but their responses were kind of structured around these three main questions. One, as to the actually what kind of autonomy the state and bureaucracy has from dominant classes in post-colonial formations. Two, Alvi's characterization of the specific class configurations of what he calls peripheral capitalism. And three, the difference, if any, of the form of the relative autonomy of the state in the post-colony compared to Western capitalist states. Now, from these critiques, we can distill three related fundamental presuppositions of what I call the Alavian problematic. One is the undue haste with which he asserts generalization of capitalist relations and wage labor, and the attendant separation of economic and political domains of moments of domination. This lends itself to a separation of the overdeveloped state from the society, which he develops, of course. Second, there is this generalization of wage labor and characterization of three dominant classes also leads Alvi to a discounting of the concrete labor regimes of control, organization, and appropriation in peripheral social formations. As a result, Alvi ends up with what I would call a truncated account of class struggle, focusing on horizontal class struggle, that is between the dominant classes, at the expense of vertical class struggle, that is between the dominant and the dominated classes. And third, Alvi draws a fundamental, almost ontological distinction between metropolitan societies with a single dominant class versus peripheral formations with a plurality of dominant classes. This then leads to an a priori notion of the relative autonomy of the state while ignoring rhythms of contestation from below, which might affect the form and modalities of rule. This geographical bracketing off also closes off Alvi to the intense creative thinking going on in the Marxist tradition at the very same moment about exactly these questions. That is on the Bonapartist form of the state, the relative autonomy of the sphere of the political, and on plural dominant classes, even in advanced capitalist formations. This in turn leads Alvi to what I would call more than a hint of Weberianism, with its attendant stark demarcations between the West and the non-West and the state-society domains. The pitfalls of this quasi-Weberian flirtation can be clearly seen in Alvi's later essays on the state and ethnicity in Pakistan. For example, in 1990 essay on authoritarianism and legitimation of state power in Pakistan, Alvi moves exclusively on the plane of machinations between individuals of the civil military bureaucracy, while subaltern struggles barely get a mention. And the issue of legitimation is reduced to a top-down manipulation of Islam by the military junta, instead of its articulation over differentiated and multiple socio-political spheres. Relatedly, the problem of the instability of formal democracy in Pakistan versus the machinations of the Praetorian Guard also remains confined to the rarefied sphere of political society itself and what Alvi calls the narrow legalism of political parties. Instead of considering these parties' wider social embeddedness and their ability or lack thereof to forge expansive hegemonic projects with their attendant stable forms of rule. Alvi here falls into a fully liberal institutionalist problematic with its separation of state society and a fundamental dichotomy between liberal democracy and military dictatorship. This narrow framing, flowing organically from Alvi's theorization of the state and mode of production, leads to a particular understanding of the politics of ethnicity in India and Pakistan. Ethnicity is here understood almost exclusively through struggles of the regionally differentiated salariate or aspiring groups to white-collar employment, especially within the state itself. While this is useful, it serves to obscure more than it reveals. For example, it does not understand the specific ideological and material mechanisms, spaces, and organizational forms through which ethnicity is defined, mobilized, and indeed forged, both within and outside the spheres of the state. To give a brief example, Alvi's account of the emergence of the Mahajir ethnicity in urban Sindh centers almost exclusively on its travails with regards to state employment and quotas, and ignores its integral linkages to shifting rhythms of the urban question in Sindh and the impact of the US imperium in the period of the late 70s and 80s. Therefore, a partial elucidation of the salience of ethnicity flows from Alvi's limited or truncated problematic, which short circuits that integral and dynamic character of state-civil society relations. That is, in Gramscian terms, the boundary traversing spheres of the integral state. However, while Alvi strictly demarcated his theorization of the post-colonial state, relative autonomy and social formation due to the issue of plurality of fundamental classes, from within Alvi's own milieu, there were cognate debates taking place in Western context too. For example, the debate on the British ruling bloc in the pages of the New York Review, initiated by Perry Anderson and Tom Nine in the 1960s, which was tackling exactly, and I quote Perry Anderson here, the unique paradox whereby in the supremely capitalist society of Victorian England, the landed aristocracy became and remained the vanguard of the bourgeoisie. That is, and end of quote, that is the problem of the plurality of dominant classes in even the so-called Western formations. Indeed, Marx himself had commented on these uneven histories of state and capitalist formation within the heart of Western Europe itself. For example, in his comparative reflections on economics, philosophy, and politics in England, Germany, and France, respectively. And of course, it was Antonio Gramsci in the interwar years who would extend the concept of passive revolution to a general understanding of state formation in Europe in the epoch of imperialism and in response to revolutionary insurgencies, and as in closing exactly these kinds of plural class alliances in the historical or hegemonic bloc. Contemporaneous to Alvi, of course, was also the famous Miliband Polanza's debate on the capitalist state in the pages of the New Left Review, which also generated insights into the specific form of the relative autonomy of the capitalist state and the issue of complex ruling blocs. Unremarked and unregistered by Alvi, it is in the later iterations of this debate where Polanza proposes that relative autonomy of the state as based in one, the formal separation of the economic and political in capitalism, and two, in the struggles between fractions of the dominant class and between dominant and dominated classes. The state here is seen as shot through its class struggle. It's related to society, not external, but as a strategic field, and as a specific material condensation of relation of forces among classes and class fractions. Therefore, the relative autonomy of the state is located here in the institutional materiality and the simultaneously relational character of the state. This could lend itself, I believe, usefully to the theorization of the post-colonial state too. The state apparatus does not exclude the plurality of fundamental classes, but would itself be a relational condensation of a ruling bloc which may include multiple classes or fractions under the hegemony of one. For example, the crystallization of the power of different social groups or de jure and de facto power in different institutions like the military, judiciary, and so on, and the conflictual unity and unstable equilibrium of compromises organized within and through the state itself. In such a conception, the extent of the relative autonomy of the post-colonial state and the specific institutional forms it takes, for example, parliamentary democracy, Praetorianism, fascism, etc., cannot be simply read off a priori from the structure or the mode of production narrowly defined. Instead, the focus is on the intensity and form of class struggle over the whole of the social formation and the integral state, whereby hegemonic and proto-hegemonic projects are condensed in specific forms of political rule and institutional arrangements. For example, Bonapartism, populism, dictatorship, parliamentary democracy, and so on. As such, the focus would be on not just the Pakistani ruling bloc or dominant classes' internal disjunctures, but also their accumulation regimes, shifting relations to global imperialism, and crucially, their attempts or lack thereof to incorporate subordinate social groups within different modalities of hegemony. It is then these different modalities of incorporation, accommodation, and exclusion, rather than a priori relative autonomy of the state from society, which then gives rise to specific institutional arrangements and forms of rule. Relatedly, a focus on the differentiated social and spatial spheres of the integral state also lends itself to a complex understanding of how hegemonic projects work through difference. That is, by drawing upon social and spatial unevenness and concretizing, fetishizing these in the form of gender, ethnicity, caste, etc. Such a mode of theorizing lends itself usefully to both theorizing multiple dominant classes within a ruling bloc, which is Alvi's concern, while also providing useful openings to avoid the binary of state society and relatedly a narrow focus on the state as the field par excellence of ethnic difference, Alvi's pitfall. The state itself here becomes a strategic field traversed by contradictions and struggles emanating in the wider social formation, while its institutional materiality, the distinction between the political state and civil society, is no static rendering of pre-given institutions, but is itself determined by these wider struggles in the social formation. Happily though, in contradistinction to some of these more static renderings of state and society, there may be seen within Alvi's over itself an indication of such a dynamic, relational and conjunctural conception of social forces. It is here that Alvi's conceptualization of the peasantry and revolution may offer useful openings to us. Now, as I've already said, Alvi's work provides important signposts for understanding colonial modes of accumulation, class and state formations. However, as we saw, there are also problems regarding lack of specificity and concreteness. Here we can mobilize another strand of Alvi's work as a corrective or complement, which is on neo-imperialism and especially on peasantry and agrarian relations in the global south. I will focus on the agrarian and peasant stuff more. But just to signpost here, Alvi was a pioneer in writing in the opening issue of the Socialist Register in 1964 in bringing attention to neo-imperialism and new forms of dependency, even in ostensibly anti-imperialist projects of import substitution industrialization. Here, Alvi elucidated the mechanisms of the new imperialism working through aid, experts, and monopolies over patents, capital goods, and technical and financial instruments. It is, however, in his work on the peasantry and agrarian relations that the full strength of Alvi's strategic analysis came to the fore. In a classic 1965 Socialist Register essay on peasants and revolution, Alvi carried out a comparative analysis of revolutionary movements in India, China, Asia, and a diachronic analysis of the role of different agrarian classes and fractions therein. Alvi showed how it is the middle peasantry, due to their different class position as independent smallholders, not directly beholden to over domination of big landlords, that provided the initial thrust of revolutionary upsurge in the rural areas in these instances. Through consideration of shifting class alliances in the Russian and Chinese revolutions, Alvi showed that there was a processual difference in what he calls the necessary conditions for mobilization of middle peasants and poor peasants. The initial middle peasant militancy thus created conditions for a more sustained coming to the fore of landless laborers and sharecroppers. Here, Alvi was particularly attuned to how multiple factors, such as patterns of absentee landlordism, World War-induced changes, and previous rounds of anti-colonial militancy, example by the Kuomintang, changed state formations themselves and set the stage for a more advanced stage of class struggle. Here was Alvi at his strategic best, a concrete elucidation of shifting class formations and alliances, combined with a conjunctural analysis of situations where the state is not simply a set of institutions external to society, but a strategic field whose machinations and contradictions integrally inform the form and content of revolutionary struggle. Alvi's pioneering analysis of the role of different sections of the peasantry would later find resonance, of course, with Eric Wolf's celebrated work, Peasant Wars in the 20th Century, which was a comparative work on 6 different peasant rebellions. Their convergence on the role of the middle peasantry eventually coming to be known as the Wolff-Alvi thesis. On a different but related note, there was also Alvi's resonance with Frantz Fanon. Fanon, of course, was more focused on the poor peasantry and its migratory potentials and political travels, example in the form of the lumpen proletariat. But like Alvi, Fanon too was attuned to the transformations of organizational form, content, and crucially space that an anti-colonial movement would have to go through to avoid isolation and encirclement by colonial forces. Here too, it was an emphasis on what Fanon calls the knowledge of the practice of action that was an ineluctable moment for bringing organizational and sociological depth to the movement. Alvi's analysis of agrarian relations did not stop here. In the inaugural issue of the Journal of Peasant Studies in 1973, and in following articles, he drew upon his deep study of caste and kinship relations in rural West Punjab. and especially the role of patrilineal kinship structures called biradari, with their norms of endogamy and control over women, in regulating the social lives of the peasantry. On the one hand, here, in contradistinction to his mode of production pieces, Alvi points to two sectors of the agrarian economy, with feudal and capitalist forms of expropriation, which exist in what he calls a multiplex mode of production. Crucially, Alvi demonstrated that the strength of Biradari ties was manifested unevenly according to class and production relations. Biradari ties for Alvi are weakest among big landlords and poor peasants, sharecroppers and landless laborers, where patron-client relations dominate. While Biradari ties were strongest among independent small-holding proprietors, the middle peasantry, where these often served as ties of horizontal solidarity for maintaining security of tenure, voting blocks, and in some cases, even as incipient class consciousness. Prefiguring later debates on the intersectionality and integral relation of class with relations of difference, Alvi warned against conceptual schema that were, I quote, primordial loyalties and structures exist in functional isolation. He insisted, therefore, on a processual understanding and relational understanding of class and social relations such as kinship. The task of engaged theoretical and political practice was one of elucidating, and I quote Alvi again, the complex mediations of the processes by which class solidarity is established and manifested, which escapes the attention of those Marxists who focus exclusively on dramatic demonstrations of class solidarity of peasants in revolutionary action. End of quote. In effect, Alvi's elucidation of kinship relations in their integral but differentiated articulation with class relations offers a vital collective to his above discussed reflections on ethnicity. Thus, where ethnic politics was seen as a function mainly of the salaried class's aspirations towards state and white-collar employment, the work on agrarian structures showed how social relations of difference are produced over multiple arenas of social practice, ranging from relations in production, the valences of everyday life, to a culmination in the sphere of the political as such, for example, via voting blocks. Alvi's work on the peasantry and rural society thus brings attention to the historical structuring of class in complex and differentiated ways, and also how these identities might be transformed in everyday life and indeed within the vortex of political struggle itself. This then is the conjunctural and strategic register of Alvi, informed by history, cognizant of structure, but with a keen awareness of the conjunctural specificity and malleability of these via the practice of struggle and the dialectic of experience itself. Just the last part. Now, what then remains of Hamza Alvi today? How may he travel and translate to our times, not through a mechanical, simply empirical, quote unquote, testing of his arguments, a failing and unfair endeavor, if there ever was one, but in a way where their abiding concerns and methods may inform our struggles and analysis today. We have already discussed how Alvi's agrarian analysis and of neo-imperialism made provocative and pioneering interventions, many of which have been taken up in contemporary Marxist and critical theory. In addition, his elucidation of how ties of kinship articulated with relations of production and the influence of these on the form, content, and intensity of political mobilization find resonance in current thinking on a reformulated agrarian question. Influenced by the expanding foci of social theory in general, a renewed effort is also being made among agrarian scholars for understanding what has been called by Michael Levian interlocking oppressions, such as the articulation of class relations with gender, caste, and race, etc. That Alvi's analysis of the peasantry are animated integrally by strategic, that is revolutionary concerns, lends an extra suppleness to his theorizing, one which may be usefully carried over to his somewhat static analysis of the post-colonial state. With regards to Alvi's very valid concerns with the Bonapartist authoritarian forms taken up by post-colonial states, we found it productive to place him in conversation with contemporaries tackling similar concerns in both metropolitan and peripheral contexts. Here, in contradistinction to more a priori notions of superstructure autonomy, a relational conception of the state lends useful openings to understanding how complex and multi-class historical blocks can produce particular forms of the state's relative autonomy. As such, in combination with Alvi's more strategic conjunctural analysis, the task becomes of concretely elucidating the class formations, the organizational content and forms of hegemonic apparatuses, and their incorporation of subaltern groups, which culminate in various forms of authoritarianism and populism. Therefore, Alvi's attention to complex and shifting forms of social differentiation, along with his attention to the state and forms of politics, can usefully inform contemporary analyses and struggles. A spate of recent agrarian thinking has grappled with issues around classes of labor, the increasingly porous urban-rural and proletarian-peasant divides, their conjugation with differentiated forms of oppression, and the relation to the reformulated agrarian question. So I'm thinking here of the work by Jens Lurch, Bernstein, Alpasha, and so on. Related to this has been a parallel concern for elucidating how processes of domination, surplus appropriation, and lumpenization might feed into different iterations of populism, agrarian and otherwise. Crucially, in wider social theory, there has been creative thinking with regards to how social relations of difference, such as race and gender, are inflected when state and politics takes on Bonapartist or populist forms. I'm thinking here of the work of Stuart Hall and Jill Hart in particular. It is here that Alvi's wide-ranging concerns, bringing together shifting and differentiated agrarian class formations, along with the culmination of these in the sphere of the state and in revolutionary struggle, offer openings and avenues of extension for our political and conceptual explorations today. Authoritarianism and dictatorship not as the cultural ontological disposition of the Black and brown peoples of the world, but as a product of the valences of colonial history, patterns of accumulation, and often indeed a reaction to contemporary struggles. Class as a central axis of exploitation, but produced in a differentiated manner through historically situated forms of difference. The conjuncture as a product of multiple structural and historical rhythms, but always open to the intervention of organized practice and struggle itself. Here, Hamza Alvi takes his rightful place as a guiding light and one of our most distinguished common denominators. Thank you very much.